questions haunt every life, writes Andy Crouch. The first, what are we meant to be? And the second, why are we so far from what we're meant to be? Hello and welcome to Restoring the Soul, a podcast dedicated to helping you close the gap from what you're meant to be and what keeps you from being all that. I'm your producer, Brian Beatty. Thanks for listening. On this edition of Restoring the Soul, Michael spends an hour with Mako Fujimura, visual artist, author, thought leader, and cultural shaper who was recently appointed director of the Brehm Center at Fuller Seminary. His paintings have been exhibited around the world and is one of the first artists to paint live on stage at Carnegie Hall. Mako is an artist whose process-driven, refractive, slow art has been described by David Brooks of the New York Times as a small rebellion against the quickening of time. Mr. Fujimura is also a well-read author. He and Michael will discuss Mako's books Culture Care, Reconnecting with Beauty for Our Common Life, and Silence and Beauty, Hidden Faith, Born of Suffering. So without any further delay, here's your host, Michael John Cusick.
Mako, welcome to our program. Thanks for making time to speak with me today.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. Your work is a Japanese art form that I understand goes back to medieval times. Can you explain what it is and how you chose that particular art form?
Yeah, Nihonga is Japanese style paintings that lineage goes back to 15th century, but you can trace it even back to as far as 8th century. But it's distinct Japanese way of painting, and that flowed out of China and Korea. But at the same time, the Japanese culture has refined many of these elements, and has, starting in, I would say, 15th century, began to really identify unique aspects of the expression using natural minerals, gold and silver, and done on silk or paper. This is what I went to Japan to study as a graduate student, and I began to really understand the fantastic refinement and integration that Japanese culture had offered as early as 16th century, and so that journey continues. I'm trying to apply the principles of aesthetics in 17th, 16th century Japan into 21st century.
Today, your paintings can be seen in galleries around the world and even in some public spaces. When did you first know that you actually wanted to be an artist?
I was always an artist and saw myself as an artist, but I didn't really know what that meant. I would say until maybe late in high school, in college, when I really began to determine what was most important to me and what I couldn't throw out of my life. I was very fortunate to have parents. My father is a research scientist, renowned acoustics pioneer.
I understand he worked with Noam Chomsky.
Yes, I was born in Boston because he was doing his doctorate with Noam Chomsky on generative grammar. So I grew up in that environment of scientists and artists. My father and both of my parents loved the arts. And my mother's side, there was a very significant artists in her family, and she would tell me about them. And so I was really encouraged to pursue the arts. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know if I could make a living at it. I had no idea what the future held, but I knew there was something important inside of me that I had to cultivate.
And in your book, River Grace, you talk about coming to faith,
yes.
And art and beauty played a big role in that.
Yeah.
I love the phrase you use where I think you said something like, you were deeply immersed in beauty and transcendence through art, but your heart didn't have a shelf to place that beauty. Will you say something more about that?
Yeah, I use that quote in my new book, Silence and Beauty, because it predicates everything that I say about Japanese culture and Endo and what the book is about, Japanese culture and silence and beauty. And my understanding of art, and of course I went to school in 80s and 90s, which meant that beauty was out of the conversation. There was just the other day a New York Times feature about Chuck Close, one of the most important artists of our time. And he was saying, today if you speak about craftsmanship, and along with that, I would say beauty. You feel like you're uttering a dirty word, and that was very much the philosophical backdrop to contemporary art, starting in 80s and 90s. So beauty was very much out, and I had no place to put that, despite the fact that I had this enormous capacity to create beauty. My own hands were making things that I had no way to justify in my philosophical system. And so that was really an important part of my journey toward faith, and understanding that I really needed a new paradigm if I were to understand who I was, and my desire to, and my response to what I saw in Japanese art, 17th century art, that is enormously beautiful and somewhat decorative in some cases. But that was the beginning of my journey. Part of the important steps in recovery of my faith.
And obviously your faith, which is a very central part of your life and your art, although in the art it's not visibly expressed like some Christians might think, we're a John 3:16 verse or something on there. Yeah. But you really integrate your faith into the books that you write. How did you go from being a visual artist to writing books? Right.
Well, everything I do is prayer. So when I'm creating, I'm deeply aware, and I was very aware of this as a child. As I look back, I don't know what to call this, but I understood transcendence, and I knew this flow that came through me as I created things, whether it be painting or writing or whatever I was doing, that I couldn't account for experientially on my own. So I knew it wasn't mine. It was a gift that came through me. And to me, everything I do, my life as a form of expression is an artwork of God, reshaping and sometimes hammering away, the unnecessary things, but the chisel is something that I have began to desire in my life, and so that writing flows out of my work as an artist, and when I am painting, I am tapped into this zone of experience that I treasure, and everything that I do, whether it be writing or speaking, or flows out of that experience.
The thing that I've enjoyed so much about your books, your new book, Silence and Beauty, which I want to talk about in a moment, your book, Culture Care, and particularly drawn to the essays in Refractions, is that it's one thing to see a person's artwork, but then to read what almost feels like exposition or commentary on your inner journey of creating, and then everything that comes out of your art as well. So your new book is called Silence and Beauty, Hidden Faith Born of Suffering, and it's a deep reflection on Shusaku Endo's book, Silence. And at the beginning of your book, Silence and Beauty, you pretty much say to the reader, if you haven't read Silence, put this book down now and read it. And you even include a summary at the end of your book for someone who doesn't want to read. But I read Silence, and the book just undid me. It is absolutely profound. What drew you to Silence, and how has Endo impacted you?
So when I started to write this book, I was asked by a friend of mine who became my agent, but he's the associate producer of the film Silence that Martin Scorsese is putting together. And he came to me. I got to know him through my Washington days as a National Council on the Arts member. And so he was in politics, and now he's trying to help culture. And he said, there's only one person who can write this book, and that's you. And I turned him down twice, and because I didn't want to revisit some of the traumas and painful journeys that I've been on actually with Endo. And I felt like this would be too much. And so he kept on insisting, so I finally said yes. And as soon as I started to write, I realized that, you're unwinding this golden thread that William Blake talked about. There's this just a sense of unraveling the mystery of your life. And, it became very clear to me that the reason why I found myself in Christ as a graduate student in Japan, of all places, going to temples and museums every day, and then encountering Fumie, stepping blocks of 17th century persecution. These were bronze images of Christ or Virgin Mary cast into bronze plates, and villagers were asked to line up by the beach and step on these images to renounce Christ. And many were tortured because they could not. And so I encountered Fumie of 17th century while studying these gorgeous, beautiful paintings of 17th century Rimpa screens in museums, and they were side by side exhibited. And then, of course, I read in the description to Fumie that Shusaku Endo has written a novel about silence.
You saw the Fumies as works of art prior to reading the book Silence.
Yeah, well, I didn't even know what to call it. It was such a profound experience. There were 19 plates at Tokyo National Museum lined up, and they were worn smooth. So many people had walked over them. 250 years of very aggressive persecution against Christians only. I didn't know much about this history. I've heard about the persecution era, but it was not visceral until that moment. And then the exhibit connected Endo's book Silence, and I had read Silence as a undergrad. I remember reading Endo. He was a new Japanese author then, relatively new in America. But I remember reading him and not really getting to the depth of it because I had no faith perspective then. I was just beginning my journey. And now looking at Fumie, being really haunted by them, and going back to Endo and rereading Silence both in Japanese and in English. And then it was a very traumatic experience for me because I was a brand new baptized believer, and in Japan, knowing that I had become a Christian in this land, and all of a sudden this history of persecution has opened up to me, and the pain and torture and suffering that went into that the time, and what Endo describes so well is a remarkable testimony of the past. And it was it was not only haunting, it was I would say it was traumatic. And so I understand that when people don't read to the end of the book, I really understand that reality, because it is hard. It is a hard book to finish, and yet, as I note in the book, Endo has set this up. So if you actually read to the end meaning the appendix, there are certain nuggets of truth, which turns out to be historical truth that is very, very much encouraging.
And is it the case that some versions of Endo's Silence don't have the appendix in it? I heard that.
No, it's not that it's not in there. It's just that it's segmented. William Johnson, when he translated it, he put the word appendix in between the last part and the end of the narrative. And in Japanese, there's no word separating the two. So that's an important thing to consider. There are several things about William Johnson's translation, which is very good translation, but there's just several things that I would do different.
So as you wrote Silence and Beauty, your most recent book, it's this very deep reflection on Endo, but it's also your own journey as well. What would you hope for the reader to gain through this interaction of your journey and Endo's novel? Yeah,
so when people read the manuscript of my book, they said, what is this book about? It seems to be about Endo, but it's not, or it is, but it's more than that. And so I began to think of it as an autobiographical journey, spiritual journey, that happens to have Endo a significant part. And without Endo, I don't think I would have uncovered many of the things that I would have, I uncovered while writing the book, that I wouldn't have seen it, even the personal narratives. Endo's book works like this. It kind of triggers through certain traumatic experience something about you that you have deeply put aside, and so it is a spiritual memoir, but it's also about Japan. It's about missions. It's about recalibrating or reforming how we view missions, what the Christians call the Great Commission, of fulfilling Christ's mandate to, preach the gospel and baptize all nations. And that I discovered while I was writing this book so much about my hope and prayer for Japanese culture, kind of inverted into this thought that, Japan is the most integrated culture in terms of nature and culture, what I call culture care. It happens in Japanese culture all the time. And the value of beauty, the value of silence, maybe something that unlocks ultimately the mystery of the gospel, rather than here we are being frustrated that, Japanese do not receive the gospel as Western churches would bring them. And this is an important criticism that Endo makes throughout his career, but particularly in Silence, that Western Christianity, the Christianity of imperialism and, bringing Western culture with the Christian message has really made things difficult for Japanese to embrace the gospel. And that's bad for the Japanese, but that's also bad for us, because that means we don't fully understand the gospel in its fullest sense.
Say more about that. How don't we fully understand
it? People think the gospel, quote unquote, is a set of information that we need to preach, we need to let people know, and that's certainly part of it. But when you think about what the gospel is the good news. It's much more than that. It is a whole narrative of the chosen people, starting from creation, being exiled and in transgressing against important order of being that we were asked to uphold, and we didn't. So our journey of exile and then the coming of Christ to fulfill the exilic journey into something of a not only redemptive story, but it's also a new creation story. In Christ we are made new, and that whole narrative, the arc of the whole narrative, has not been what we hear when we go to churches or evangelistic meetings. We seem to truncate that, and sometimes for necessary reasons of letting people know about this historical reality. But what it assumes is that we fully know and understand this life of God or the gospel message, and that's a really, really dangerous assumption, because as we know, as journey into Christ spiritually, the more you know, the less we know. The more we seem to get to the heart of things, the more mysterious it becomes, and more you are basically confessing of not only your own failures to do the things that you ought to have done, but do the things that are left undone, and also the reality of God, who remains invisible, a mystery, and yet so profoundly together in this unified oneness of that holds everything together, and Christ as the creator, Colossians passage about Christ being the creator. All of that is not something that we can grasp in a simple sentence or even a series of lectures. It is a life force and a life way of life that has to be lived through. And many times God calls us to traumatic realities, dark realities, to really begin to understand how we don't understand and we fail short. And yet this is what happens in the book Silence. I think it's a profound book about meditation of darkness. So I call it the Holy Saturday book. There's Good Friday, there's Easter Sunday, but there's that middle Saturday that we don't talk about. And so many authors, Catholic writers, tend to dwell there, as well as people like T.S. Eliot.
And the darkness that you're referring to in Silence is not simply the horrific physical persecution and torture that you see, but it's the darkness of one's own failure and the darkness of one's own unfaithfulness, so that for these 16th and 17th century Portuguese missionaries, their whole goal became to not fail. And then when they were persecuted and they failed, then it was seen as a failure. And you actually write in Silence and Beauty, if I can just read this quote, "We have a tendency to extol heroes of faith. Our textbooks and our sermons are filled with the heroic. In doing so, we fall into a false dichotomy of seeing faith only in terms of victory and failure, which leads us to dismiss and discard the weak. Endo stands with those sitting in the pews who feel inadequate and uncertain, who doubt whether they can be strong, heroic, and faith-filled." So it's this idea that that's what the gospel is for, but we so easily miss the point. How do the arts, which you're deeply involved in, how do the arts help us to not miss the point?
Yeah, and this is one of the discoveries I made while writing this book, that the arts are fundamentally about that, the journey of brokenness and realizing an honest, authentic experience. We fall short all the time, and we market things as this triumphant way of success, American success, perhaps. And those are easier to market because you can, reduce the message into very much a package. And the rest of us who, fall by the sideways, and we don't quite live up to that expectation of perfection and material success and even beauty, being able to capture or express beauty. We're in this constant mode of depression because the world and this culture in particular has certain expectations that we can't meet. And for those of us, that story. Now this is what artists, true artists, instinctively are drawn to. Like Endo, they would much rather hear the story of the homeless or the immigrants or people who do not have a voice, and they consider these things very deeply and have a way of capturing that through words or by writing about them, by painting, by creating movies out of them. And so it actually brings empathy into visceral, incarnational reality. And this is what art can do that perhaps very few mediums can attain.
You've also said that art can play a central role in making peace in the world. But how can the arts play a role in making peace? Yeah,
and this seems so absurd to say that beauty and art is essential, especially in times like this. When there's chaos and unrest, there's terror and fear and anxiety, and we say, well, we need stronger military, or we need this and that. But we actually need to step back and realize that our culture has not cultivated this art of beholding, this art to pay attention to the fragile things around us, the mysteries of beauty that fills the universe, despite the fact that we don't need them. There's no utilitarian purpose for beauty. And we should, if we believe the pundits or the scholars, discard those things that are necessary in order to survive. But that thought is the beginning of this dark journey toward not knowing what it is to be human, to be fully human and alive. And so, I think it was Leonard Bernstein, the conductor, who said, in times of darkness, we need to actually amplify the experience of beauty and to go after it. I am paraphrasing here, but deeply there's something deeply human about seeking beauty that when and in peaceful times or times we are very complacent, perhaps we don't think about those things, but when things are being so forced into this trauma, and there's just so much pain and suffering in the world, we should provide for those who are in need, and that's should be the least of what we do. But we also have to realize that compassion and beauty are two elements that can endure these moments of darkness, and they may yet generate something new into the world. And you look at the history of art and literature. If you removed all the literature that came out of war times, that came out of trauma, that came out of difficult seasons of cultural history, you'd have to be very little. You think about Hemingway, you think about Dante, you think about Fra Angelico, you think about, all these masters who came out writing about their dark times. These people are writing and painting and making sense of the world through beauty in times when most people didn't even think that was possible. So these are the people that I've learned from, and Endo is certainly one of those people.
So the pragmatist in me wants to ask you, if you had an infinite budget and resources, what would it look like to wage peace and to allow the arts to create peace in the midst of these really turbulent times?
Yeah. So the beauty of this is that you don't need a budget to do it. It's just every day your awareness and your appreciation and your commitment to create in the midst of chaos and darkness. That's all you need.
So you're referring to not just a person who paints like you, or a person who creates film or literature and therefore not artistic in the traditional sense, but this idea that you get to in culture care, the idea of generativity, that we're all called to be creators. And it's that generativity that pushes back against the darkness. Say more about that generativity.
That's right. So, if I had a huge budget to work with, what I would do is to go back to the basics of education that allows young children in impoverished places to be able to have the basic needs met, but that would lead to experience of beauty for them, and this is kind of may seem crazy and radical, but there are those without voice in this world that has been left untouched, and we do nothing for them, the least of these. And I think that's what we need, transformation. And the rest of us who are doing reasonably well, we need that experience of hearing the voices that cannot be heard because of the constant noise that is out there in our lives, that we need to get back to the basics. But going back to culture care and generativity, yes, this is a call for everyone. Just as if we care about the environment, and if we're hiking and we see a Coke can, we pick it up. If 1,000 people did that, the trails will be clean. And that same thing with culture is that if we care about culture, then rather than fighting over this limited zero-sum game of a limited resource environment, why don't we see the culture as a place of abundance and care for it with very simple acts of kindness, but also tilling the soil into the future, so that the work that you do today, you may not see the result of, but your children and your grandchildren may benefit from. Those principles still apply. They're very simple principles. Leave the place better than you came into it. And if we can just begin to do that and see culture not as us versus them. Culture wars assume that we have this culture and they have this culture. It's a different culture, and we're fighting over it. But when you really think about it, culture is us. We need to own that. Every element that we're fighting against is an element that is whether by via negativa of fighting against it, you're still within it, right? So it's not as if you can eradicate that, which we don't desire. It's a good instinct to want, wholesome, safe for the whole family, kind of a. But culture does not work like this. We are embedded. It's far more mysterious and complex than we want to think. So it's better to see culture as a garden to take care of. If there are weeds, put it out. If there, but that means you have to really understand the soil, the complexity of the soil, and how there is no black and white judgment that you can make that is clear cut. You have to deal with the mystery of that environment and test things by the fruit of your labor, and learn each time that doesn't work. Have this humble approach that a farmer or gardener will have toward their land, and not to rape the land for utilitarian purposes, but to allow it to flourish so that all neighbors can flourish, not just us, or and that attitude, So I think artists are gardeners who are called to till the soil of culture. It's hard work. There are many winters we don't see anything happening, and yet when that in the spring flowers are coming up, that somebody invested in that soil, and that work is worthwhile because that beauty can benefit everybody.
So culture care is really, it's a very broad concept, but it's an alternative to boycotting culture, resisting culture, which often takes on an arrogant form.
Right, and there's nothing wrong with prophetically standing against the cultural forces of darkness. And this is not a war against culture wars. It really is to affirm the prophetic instinct as well. And I've been thinking a lot about this. What Dr. King did in his speech, his last speech, the day he gave day before he shot, the mountaintop speech, is just so profound because it affirms this idea that we can talk about war and peace all day. But we're at a point in our culture where it's either nonviolence or non-existence. And if that's the case, we kind of stepped over the boundary of human existence to now we have to deal with this human instinct toward imperialistic, triumphalism to capture the land and win at all cost. If we are at a point where that is self-destructive, ultimately, then we have to create another way of even resisting against the forces of darkness. And that's part of culture care is that, do we care enough to think about the enemy? And to think about what is causing this demise and its sickness that we all inherit as a culture, and how are we to create a new conversation that affirms diversity, that does not assume that everybody can agree on these issues, but to be able to have this flexible way of not just coexisting, but I call this cultural estuary in the book Culture Care. Estuaries are not homogeneous. It's fantastically dangerous place, heterogeneous, with many competing elements. But that's why it's so abundant and delicate, and it feeds the creatures that are going upstream, and then it nourishes them as they go back to the ocean. It is the most fantastic, diverse, most important part of the ecosystem. And so we need more cultural estuaries where we can affirm the differences as well as what we're for.
Mako, you recently accepted a position at the Brehm Center at Fuller Theological Seminary, and is the emphasis with there so that you can expand the role of culture care in your calling?
Yes, and I'm so delighted that President Mark Labaton invited me with this crazy idea to be an artist in the midst of a seminary, a major seminary, the largest seminary in the world, and to have a studio space there to work with fellows that I get to pick out and the other artists in residence and good people that have for years labored to care for culture there, and scholars and theologians and psychologists, and so we're getting ready for our next summit in February 8th through 12th in Pasadena, where we bring together elements of soul care with culture care. I would love to have you there with us, and to start to integrate theological formation with spiritual development and formation with cultural formation. What would look like if one community, one person held these integrated points and bring that into the world. And I'm very excited about the possibilities I'm already seeing in a short time. I'm there winter quarters, and I spend the rest of the time in Princeton studio, but I'm seeing fantastic results from even the short time that we've been doing this. And this is, I hope, will be a resource to people out there, theologians and pastors, but also people in the pews, people in entrepreneurial business practices, people who are serving, people who are working around the world, and that they will feel empowered to seek beauty when and also to understand that theological integration of the gospel, person fully made alive, is beautiful. That's the ultimate enigmatic burning bush that God imparts into the world, and every single person has the capacity to be that burning bush.
Wow, I love that.
Yeah, and you're walking burning bushes, and communities burning with this paradoxical reality of upholding something that is so orthodox and traditional, and yet it is progressive and new, and that kind of communal. And I think that may be the ultimate artwork that we can be involved in.
It sounds like that vision will profoundly expand the conversation about the story of God and the beauty of that.
I think so. So the backdrop to culture care is that I had written, aside from what you read in culture care, these chapters that I gave lectures to all sorts of audiences, not just within the church, but outside the church as well. There are spiritual and theological premises that go into each of those that I don't reveal. And so I'm working on another book called Theology of Making, which may take me 3 years to finish, but it is about what we talked about, the whole narrative of the Bible, the good news that flows from creation to new creation, that allows for us to understand the story of God, as you say. There's this vast reality of mystery that we're just tapping into, I think. And artists and makers have a particular intuitive knowledge that needs to be part of the theological discourse. And so what I'm trying to do is not just to bring artists into the conversation, but have them lead in this discussion, because they hold this integrative knowledge that, to me, essence of both creation and new creation.
I think it was Bono, and interestingly, I remember this from Rolling Stone. He said that
Right. And that's what I keep insisting on, is this is not just for artists and, people who have the means to buy art, or this is for everyone, and especially those who are marginalized and oppressed and today persecuted. They need to know that their voices do matter, that there is artistry, that if we can all collectively work toward an expression that allows for these voices to resonate in the most important decisions being made today in the world, then yes, it profoundly changes how we view the world, how we view politics, how we view the academic discourse, and I think that's what potentially what culture care conversation, and this is a charge that I believe we are given at the Brehm Center.
We've been speaking broadly about culture and the world, but I want to bring it back for a moment as we wrap up to the personal. In Silence and Beauty, you have a chapter called Ground Zero, and you share your story of 9/11, living 2 blocks from the towers where the planes hit. You also make reference to Hiroshima, the original Ground Zero, where you've spoken. And so talk to me about why you integrate writing about your own trauma in your work, and also how ground zeros are, as you say, a universal condition.
Yeah. So actually, I was just communicating with a fellow artist friend in Paris, and his Japanese artist who, waking up each morning with anxiety and trauma over what's happening in France. And I remember writing this sentence, and I'm still owning up to it. And it comes from another book that I read that a pastor recommended me to read. And it's about this dream that this one pastor had after losing everything, his wife, his mother, I think his daughters, in a single automobile accident. And he had this dream, recurring dream, of his chasing after the sunset over and over. And then I think it was his sister who said, "But you're going the wrong way. If you want to meet the sunrise, you go the other way. You go into the darkness." It's a really profound message, and one that I fail to do often. I keep running away. And so writing for me and painting for me is to go into the darkness, to know that I don't know what I'm doing, and I'm not capable of surviving this. But I just have to, if I'm going to make a step, let's do that. And over the years since 9/11, actually it started for me kind of this post-depression that I went through after I heard about Columbine High School here in Colorado. And I just had this deep angst about it. I just realized that there was something so much deeper, and this darkness encroaching, us, and so I began to paint images about that, and then 9/11 happened, and I was forced to be Ground Zero resident, and then my kids growing up there became ground zero children, and then realizing that my grandfather, as a scientist working for the government, had to observe Hiroshima a week or two after the bombing, and he could never talk about it, that link of generations going back to Endo's generation, post-atomic devastation and trauma that Japan is, I think, still recovering from. Those things that I wanted to run away from kept on coming up, obviously, as I wrote this book. And so, as I said, it's not something I want to do, but I'm, after going through the process, I'm glad for it, because it's something that I discovered, things that I would never have discovered otherwise, and that experience I'm realizing is so much more important today. So, this is what I would say to people who are going through trauma right now: is that story of, let's, as artists, turn back and try to find that sunrise on the other side. And I want to journey with them so that they can do the same. We don't know what the result of that is, but I think that journey will be profoundly important for the world, future generations. And if you have children, if you have grandchildren, you know that we can only do so little for them. But at the same time, the power of creativity and this reality of love, right, that flows us into this creative reality is what God will use to hold the world together, and so this is a journey that I've been on, and part of what I try to do when I lecture or when I teach or when I mentor people is to try to do that, to be alongside.
I just want to say thank you for your faithfulness to your calling that has so many diverse aspects to it. And my hope is that many more people find out about your books and your writing through this interview. So, Mako Fujimura, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
So we've wrapped up another episode of Restoring the Soul. We want you to know that Restoring the Soul is so much more than a podcast. In fact, the heart of what we have done for nearly 20 years is intensive counseling. When you can't wait months or years to get out of the rut you're in, our intensive counseling programs in Colorado allow you to experience deep change in half-day blocks over 2 weeks. To learn more, visit restoringthesoul.com. That's restoringthesoul.com.